Welcome to the world of Final Fantasy II. This series is going to be a little bit different from past things I've done. If you've been with this channel for a while, you may already know that I've already played through both Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy III for the NES. So you know what? I just figured, what the hell, let's throw Final Fantasy II into the mix as well. Now, for this series, like I just said, I'm going to be doing something a little bit differently. It's kind of like the Final Fantasy I series, but kind of different. How I did Final Fantasy I was that I had pre-recorded the entire playthrough of the game, then I just recorded commentary to put over that. I'm doing the same thing with this, but with a slightly different theme. The theme of the first Final Fantasy game was to share stories, share my history and my experiences with the Final Fantasy series as a whole, and focus mostly on that. Final Fantasy II is going to be approached a little bit differently though, because I did not want to turn this into a standard Let's Play, especially because of how tedious this game is, and part of what I wanted to do was capture that tedium by not having a bunch of cuts that skip over a lot of the random encounters, a lot of the wandering from place to place, and a lot of the pointless casting of spells, which is like 50% of the experience, is just casting spells to do nothing for no other reason than to level them up, especially if you're using certain spells like Basuna and Aura and Barrier. Spells that are extremely situational and you won't need very often, and even when you do need them, you might not get the effects you need out of them because they might not function correctly. Unless you've cast them hundreds of times on targets that don't need the spells in order to level them up, but I digress. We can get into that a little bit later. I was just letting the flow of the conversation move naturally, which got off on that tangent. The point is, I decided to take the same approach with this game where I recorded all of the footage in advance and am now talking over it. But I'm not going to just focus on Final Fantasy stories, especially because I don't have enough history left without repeating myself from the Final Fantasy I playthrough in order to get through this entire mess of a game. Instead, the idea of this series is more just general discussion. Some episodes might be kind of like vlogs, where I just discuss things that I've been up to recently, assuming I feel motivated enough and care enough to discuss something that mundane. Another idea I have for future episodes of this is to sort of record commentary for video ideas that I've had that, for one reason or another, I don't think I will actually make. Some of these might include various countdown videos or discussions of certain aspects of other games. I'm not entirely sure yet. I'm just going to be playing it by ear. If I get in the mood to record some sort of commentary, either based on a particular topic or just whatever, I might go ahead and do that, and just have it be to the Final Fantasy II footage playing in front of you. So, it could be something that you could just listen to if you want something to listen to, like a podcast or something, just something to have playing in the background, and you won't really have to be concerned with what's going on in the game, aside from hearing the music and sound effects. But you won't need to be watching what's happening in order to follow what's going on in the conversation. In fact, unlike Final Fantasy 1, I don't even have the gameplay footage going in front of me at present. I just didn't feel like bothering. I didn't want that to be a possible distraction, so there's not going to be any sort of reactions to what's happening in the game. So that's what this series is going to be, basically. Will I beat this game? I don't know. I do have all of the footage for the completed game, but whether or not this series ever actually reaches the end of the game will depend entirely on what I think of to talk about during these videos and how long those topics are able to carry the series, especially if some topics wind up dragging on or end up not lasting very long. I have some ideas that I feel like could fill maybe an hour or so of footage, but that's not very much. And some of them could wind up going shorter, or some of them could wind up going longer. I imagine longer is more probable because I tend to ramble when I'm not following a script. But we'll just have to wait and see. And getting back on topic real quick, because for a second I lost my train of thought. Because I was explaining how you could watch this as a podcast sort of thing without needing to watch the footage. But at the same time, this could also be viewed as something that you watch. So it doesn't have to just be exclusively something you listen to. If you would rather be sitting down and watching something, which I personally prefer, I honestly am not into just listening to stuff unless I've watched it before. I'll oftentimes put on some sort of YouTube video in the background when I'm doing certain activities and I want some background noise, but never a video that I haven't watched before, which is why I'm not really personally interested in the podcast format. Because if I'm sitting down and watching a podcast, there's nothing to watch but people just sitting there talking. And it's not even that interesting to watch because you're sitting there watching them sitting in front of a microphone. Bleh. You're watching them sitting in front of a microphone. That doesn't make for very interesting footage to watch. It makes you feel like you're watching the news or something, and gives that sort of energy. So that doesn't really interest me. And if I'm going to listen to something, I want it typically to be, again, a video that I've watched before. So then I can be listening to it and still have a general idea of what's happening. I can still follow it without needing to be seeing what's on screen because I can envision what's happening on screen roughly enough to follow the story or the discussion or whatever. But by having a gameplay footage going with the commentary, I believe that gives something to watch for people who want to watch. So if you're somebody who just wants to listen, then you can have commentary that the footage doesn't matter, so you're not missing anything by not seeing the footage. But if you want something to watch, then you have the game going to give you visuals to be perceiving while listening to the commentary and doing whatever you're doing while watching TV. This first video, though, I thought I would keep things a little simple and go over Final Fantasy II, particularly for people who are not familiar with the game and would like to have a bit of an understanding of how the game works and what it's about. We'll start with summarizing the story. I'm not going to get into spoilers, So if you want to actually be following along with what's going on, you'll need to be reading as stuff pops up. And honestly, if you're watching, then at this point you've already seen the story. But maybe for people who are just listening to this and are curious about Final Fantasy II, or you've only been half paying attention to what's on the screen and would like a summary of the general plot of the game, then we can get into that. So the game begins... Hang on a second. So the game begins in a world where an evil empire called Palamecia is basically trying to conquer the world. Nothing too interesting there, very generic setup. And it begins with the Kingdom of Fynn being under attack by the Palamecian Empire. And the four main characters, Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon, are attacked while trying to escape the village of Fynn. They don't make it, but they're recovered by other refugees from Fynn, who have established a base of operations in the nearby town of Altair to form a resistance army against Palamecia, although Leon, Maria's brother, has gone missing. Nobody knows where he is, and he wasn't anywhere to be seen when the other three were recovered. Now, normally when I play an RPG and characters have established default names, I usually go with those, but for this playthrough I decided to do something a little bit different. I named one character Daryl after myself, and I also named two of the characters Azure and Gatai, named after a couple of my friends who also happen to have YouTube channels. And then the fourth character I named Kylene after the main character of my book. And the story of the game is basically that the main characters join this resistance and get sent on various missions throughout the game to help the resistance fight back Palamecia. This can involve things like gathering intelligence from nearby towns, collecting items to help the resistance, or raiding important facilities run by the Palamecia Empire. Like one of the earliest quests is to head to a nearby town and infiltrate the Mithril mine and take out the Palamecian soldiers there in order to collect mithril for ourselves to forge more powerful weapons so we can fight back, because the Empire's armaments are just too much more powerful than those of the Resistance in order to actually put up a fight. So that's the premise of the story. Gameplay-wise, this game, it's not good. It has a lot of potential, and an interesting thing about this game is I do feel like it becomes more fun the more you know about the game. This game is extremely esoteric, and it has a lot of hidden mechanics, and it can be extremely frustrating if you don't understand those mechanics, or if you don't even realize that certain things are working against you. But in more recent years especially, I still don't think the game is particularly good or fun, but I do think that the game does become better the more you understand it. It's definitely the kind of game where it might be a good idea to go online and look up as much information as possible to understand how all of the mechanics work, in order to play the game efficiently and also to plan your party. Because your three starting characters they all basically start out as blank slates. They have some slight variance with their starting stats, so they are catered more towards specific types of builds than others. Guy, for example, starts out with the highest strength, and Maria starts off with the highest intellect, so having them focus on fighting or magic respectively will get you a stronger start, but there's nothing stopping you from building them up completely differently from that. It's more just a nudge to get you started and sort of suggest maybe using these characters in this certain way, and if you choose to do so, you'll get a bit of a head start on your stats and the development of those characters in those roles. And as far as developing those characters goes, there's no conventional level ups or experience points in this game. Instead, all of the actions you perform or all of the actions performed against you develop your stats accordingly based on how you play. This is an interesting mechanic because it complements how you play, but it's also one of the worst things about the game because it forces tedium onto the player in order to develop the way they want. I get the idea of the game, that by playing the game you get stronger accordingly, and on paper this makes a lot of sense, rather than just choosing a job system and then needing to abide to that job's abilities in order to get the most out of them. Instead, the game is designed to grow around the player. If you're attacking a lot, it will reward you with higher strength and higher levels with your weapons. If you're casting a lot of spells, it will make your spells stronger. If you're getting beat up a lot, you'll get more hit points and more defenses. It's designed so that your characters will naturally grow into the characters you want them to be, not because you chose a job and developed that job and conformed to that job's abilities, but rather the game is conforming to you. It's developing your characters based on how you're playing, which in turn would likely naturally be what you want. You don't really have to. It feels like it's designed so that you shouldn't really have to plan out what kind of characters you want, because the characters will naturally become what you want by adapting to how you're playing the game, rather than just arbitrary choices that you're trying to make and trying to build your characters into whatever. The problem is the game is way too tedious and doesn't really work all that well in that sense. You would think that if you want to be a wizard, just casting a bunch of spells is enough. And sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. It really depends on the spell. One of the biggest problems with this game, again, is how tedious it is, especially in order to get use out of certain spells. I already mentioned a few earlier, and that it takes this interesting idea of the characters being what you want, and instead of it feeling rewarding by just letting you play the game how you want and the game adapting to your decisions, it instead turns into a tedious mess of feeling forced to want to play the game how it wants you to play in order for the way you want to play paying off. Like I said, certain spells, like Basuna, you have to cast hundreds of times on nothing in order to maybe get use out of it later on. The Basuna spell in particular, what it does is it heals temporary status effects, which are status effects that wear off after battle. But in order for it to be at a high enough level to even function, you're going to have to be casting it dozens, perhaps hundreds of times on characters who are not afflicted with anything, just to level it up enough so that it can work. So what ends up happening is battles get dragged out because of this system, because you feel forced to be wasting your time in order to play the game correctly. Now, with some spells this works fine. Spells like Ice and Fire, the level up system works fine with those because every time you cast those spells, it's not a waste. The problem is spells like the aforementioned Basuna and other spells like Aura, Barrier, stuff like Shell, even to an extent. These spells that have very niche uses, yet you have to be using them as frequently as anything else in order to get an advantage from those niche uses, whereas spells like that should level up faster. It's as simple as that. A spell like Basuna, for example, would be so much more bearable if it leveled up quicker than other spells. The problem is that every spell is created equally, which in turn makes the spells not created equally. Because while you're getting use every time you cast Fire, you're not getting use every time you cast Basuna. A spell like Basuna should level up considerably faster than Fire, but maybe only get experience points if you actually cast it on a valid target. The spell may not have to work in order to get the experience points, but it should only gain experience points if cast on a valid target, so you're getting legitimate use out of it. You're not wasting your time spamming this useless spell just to make it usable when you might need it. Instead, you're using the spell when it can be useful, and then maybe it's leveling up after only like 10 casts. And honestly, it's mostly the magic. Everything else, the system works fine. You're attacking a lot, you get more strength. The game is building your character around what you're doing with them. You're casting a lot of black magic, they get more intellect. You're casting a lot of white magic, they get more spirit. You're getting beat up a lot, the game protects you by giving you more hit points and more stamina, and more evasion. With the stats, the system works perfectly fine because your characters are growing according to how you're using them. It's mostly with the spells, because some spells just require so much tedious nothing in order to be useful that so much of the game falls apart, especially when you actually want to be using those spells, and so you're forced into this tedium pattern of making battles last 5 times as long as they need to in order to use these spells when they will actually be useful. And this can even be detrimental in the NES version if you're trying to build up status spells or something on a character, because stats can also go down. Specifically, strength, stamina, and not spirit, but intellect can go down after battle. And I don't know how stamina reduction works, but with strength and intellect, it's based on using the opposite. If you're attacking a lot, you can lose intellect. If you're casting a lot of magic, you can lose strength. So especially if you're trying to create a character who's like a fighter mage or something, it becomes detrimental when you're having to spam these spells to level them up. Especially, and then you wind up losing strength from a situation where you didn't even need the spell. You're just using it to level up, not using it for strategy or to help you at all. Although the game does have some payoff with that, because certain spells that are useless early on do become extremely useful later in the game. It's just you have to get over that bump of all that tedious grinding, and the grinding really never ends until like the final dungeon, when you're likely not going to be concerned with it anymore because you're at the home stretch, so now you're just pushing to the end. That said, I actually really like this game's battle system, aside from that tedium. Hang on, I gotta check on something with the dog real quick. Sorry about that. I just had to go check something. And for the sake of, I could have said this before leaving, but for the sake of keeping the game going, any times when I have to step away will be retained in the videos, because, to keep the game going. Otherwise, it's even less likely that we will see the end of this thing, especially because with the aforementioned tedium of this game, it takes a while to get through. Anyway, I wanted to go on to the battle system off of the discussion of the grinding and such, because if you take out the tedium of the game and you don't account for interesting gimmicks and mechanics and abilities and all that stuff from later Final Fantasy games, if you just take the core elements of the battle system, then this is one of maybe even my favorite battle system in the Final Fantasy series. And that is largely because of how it implements rows and how that makes for interesting tactics and gameplay, especially once you get further and start fighting more interesting enemies and start coming across more interesting formations where you have a lot more to consider than just who to attack. First of all, there's your party's formation. Your guys are divided between a front row and a back row. Back row characters cannot be attacked by melee hits, weapons, and stuff like that, unless it's a bow. They can only be attacked by ranged attacks like bows as well as magic. But they also can't attack enemies without ranged attacks of their own. You can't have somebody in the back row hit enemies with a sword or something like that. But if your front row guys are defeated, then your back row guys become vulnerable. You won't really be seeing much of that in this playthrough because I didn't really utilize the back row very much in this run. I oftentimes will have at least one or two guys in the back casting magic or using a bow, but I didn't really do that in this particular run. I wanted to focus more on hybrid characters having lots of strength while also having lots of magic. There wasn't a build I wanted in this game, save for one or two of the side characters we get along the way that I wanted to put in the back row. Now, that isn't particularly interesting. It kind of can be, especially if you want to maybe have a real tanky guy in the front protecting you from stuff, while your back row guys are casting magic and such. But what makes this battle system so interesting is the rows of the enemies. Enemies can be arranged in up to 4 rows, going front to back. And enemies that are, and you can only target the front 2 rows with melee attacks. And in turn, only the front 2 rows of the enemy formation can attack with melee attacks, just like with your rows. The back row enemies can only attack with bows and magic, and in turn, you can only hit them with magic. You might be able to hit them with bows from the back row, or from the front row, but I'm not sure. I've never actually tested that. But you cannot hit enemies in the back row with a bow if the bow wielder is in the back row. But the back row can still hit them with magic. This, I think, makes for a lot of a really interesting decision-making in battle. Especially because you can manipulate how the rows advance. For example, let's say there's 4 enemies. Let's say you're up against 6 enemies. 2 of them are in the 4th row. 2 of them are in the 3rd row. 1 is in the front. 1 is in the 2nd row. 1 is in the 1st row. You could theoretically. There's multiple ways that you could approach this situation. Do you focus fire on the 2nd row guy and just ensure taking him out? And then the next round only have to deal with the front row guy, while the back row guys can't do anything. Then once the front row guy is defeated, you're now dealing with all four of the enemies because now all of them are in the front row. Or do you focus fire on the first row guy first, and then the second round of that combat you're now contending with 3 enemies, and then what do you do from there? Do you try to take out 1 of them, 2 of them? Which ones do you take out? How do you want the enemy formation to be advancing? And this can be applied in so many different ways, especially once you start getting more status effects. Things like blind and confusion can completely alter how you want to approach things, because if the enemy has a weak front row and a strong back row, you could do things like fighting the front row in a way that maintains their front row for a little bit longer, while setting up the back row with spells like Curse and Blind, so that when you get to the back row, they're already debilitated. And this can also add usefulness to certain types of spells as well. If an enemy mage is in the front row, in particular, you're probably better off just killing them. But if there's an enemy mage in the back row, you can't reach them as quickly, but they're still going to be blasting you with magic, so that's a situation where it might be worth hitting them with silence or sap to disable their magic, while your fighters are thinning out the front row. And you'll be seeing some of that throughout this playthrough if you're actually watching the footage. But that is one of the that's my favorite thing about this game, is the battle system. Except for all the tedium. There's all that stupid, tedious bullshit that's added by the grinding. But if you take that out, then I feel like you have a really solid and interesting battle system that manages to be surprisingly deep, tactically speaking, despite the fact that it's so simplistic. One example that comes to mind is the very first time I beat this game, I managed to get the Confused spell, which is shocking. The probability of getting a Confused scroll to teach to any of your characters is shockingly low. There's nowhere in the game to buy it, and only a handful of enemies drop the spell, including some enemies that you might only ever encounter throughout the game as bosses. But I managed to get it, I taught it to somebody, and I remember in the final dungeon, using that to really thin out the enemies, because there are formations in the final dungeon where there will be cockatrices in the back row. So I would confuse them, so then they start taking things out, while I'm focusing on the front row. So I'm confusing their enemies that can't do anything. And yes, I could be confusing the enemies that are a threat, but I could be attacking them. I would rather just be attacking them and taking them out, while confusing the enemies that I can't reach, because it's the only thing I can do to them. And in turn, I'm taking the enemies out from both fronts simultaneously. And that's really interesting to me, as opposed to if it was just a standard battle system and a lot of those tactics would be pointless. Why bother silencing a wizard when you could just smack him and he'll die? Why bother blinding an enemy when you can just smack him and he'll die? A lot of Final Fantasy games trivialize the usefulness of status effect spells and tactics by just making your offensive abilities so strong that relying on anything else is a waste of time. Final Fantasy II's battle system complements tactical play by enforcing this system of rows and restricting who you can target depending on the conditions of the battle, so that there's a reason to all of your options that are available to you, and making those decisions based on the immediate circumstances of the battle. A spell or ability that is completely useless in one battle can be a lifesaver in another, strictly based on the enemy formation and who you can reach with what in any given instance, and how you want to manipulate the enemy's formation in a way that you're perhaps limiting their options or reducing the amount of damage you're receiving in return, because you're limiting how many enemies can attack you until you're better set up with spells like Blind or Protect. You could focus fire on the frontline enemies in a way that sustains them, making it so that their main force in the back can't reach you until you've cast Protect Protect or Blink a few times, so that when you do reach that more threatening back row, they're already disabled. And it also makes the battles interesting in the sense that it makes it as if there's multiple phases to the fight. Each row or each grouping of enemies is like a phase, but it's almost like you're fighting 2 or 3 battles at once, but instead of them actually being separate battles, they're interconnected in a way that while you're dealing with what's essentially the first battle of this confrontation, you're taking the initiative to prepare yourself for the second. That's another way to look at it that I think makes it interesting. And that's also why ineffective attacks are important. I believe some future versions of this game remove ineffective attacks, or at least give you the option to turn them off. But when your attacks can be redirected, it kind of subtracts from the experience of the battle system, especially if there's only one enemy target within reach, and you kill it with just one of your guys. Your attacks are now going to be redirected to the next group of enemies because they're now the front row, and in doing that, you're beating up guys that can't defend themselves with abilities that the game isn't really designed to expect, you could say. And that can further trivialize some of your tactical options when you can just attack shit to make progress instead of having to use specific types of tools and abilities that are at your disposal based on the circumstances. Final Fantasy V also has a back row system, but that's a little bit less interesting. I feel like that is more restrictive, because you can still target back row and front row enemies. All it really does is the further in the back the enemies are, the less effective your physical attacks are going to be. Which ultimately, I feel like just... in a lot of ways, I feel like that system just affects the order that you're attacking the enemies in order to be the most efficient, rather than Final Fantasy II, where you're fighting the battle in phases, so to speak. Especially because the enemies in the back are still attacking you, so they're still an active threat, which can add some use to certain spells like sleep and stop, but I don't know, it just doesn't hit the same as Final Fantasy V's use of the row system. Final Fantasy V's use of the row system doesn't hit quite the same as Final Fantasy II's. And Final Fantasy III also did it a lot like Final Fantasy V. Although I believe in Final Fantasy V, the improved defenses of the enemies are progressive based on how far back they are. So there can be like a front row enemy who's taking max damage, a middle row enemy who's taking middling damage, and a back row enemy who's taking almost nothing, based on their relationship to the sprites. Whereas in Final Fantasy III, it does it the same way as Final Fantasy II, where enemies that are 3 rows back or further are protected, but they can still be targeted. It just might not be very wise. But that game also doesn't have ineffective attacks, so you can tear through enemies by focusing on the front row guys and then having attacks automatically progress to the back as enemies are slain. Point is, I like Final Fantasy II's battle system and the tactical depth it provides. Despite how simplistic the system is at its core, it's just that doesn't make the battles fun. That's the problem. Despite having an enjoyable battle system, the battles still are not necessarily fun because of the tedious grinding. Also, the difficulty is a bit wonky. From all of my experiences of the game, the game starts out kind of difficult, kind of not. It's not too difficult early on. The difficulty mostly comes from resource management because you don't really have much to work with. You do not have the money to be buying a bunch of potions to keep yourself alive, and you have very limited hit points and magic points, so you can become quickly overwhelmed and quickly deplete your resources before making it through a dungeon. Then there's the middle of the game, where enemies suddenly become ridiculously powerful, and you're struggling to win fights. Fights can sometimes feel like boss battles with every encounter, depending on what you're fighting. But then getting over that middle game, suddenly the difficulty plummets near the end, because suddenly out of nowhere, you feel completely overpowered. Especially once some of your spells, specifically your status effect spells, start getting over that threshold where they go from doing basically nothing to finally functioning because they're now at a high enough level to hit targets. So suddenly the game starts becoming significantly easier once you get past a certain point. And while the final dungeon can still be tricky with some battles, most of that just boils down to the game throwing overly broken and cheap shit at you, like enemies that can confuse or just outright instant kill you. Getting back to the original topic, though, of the game's mechanics, this is sort of a subject-swapping whiplash, but I meant much earlier to talk about the keyword system. I wanted to bring that up either before or after discussing the story, but that's just not how the conversation went. And oftentimes, when you're just letting a discussion flow naturally, the direction it goes may not be identical to what you planned it to be. Planning out a discussion will likely just make it feel mechanical or forced, as opposed to just naturally letting things flow. So the keyword system it's not good. In fact, it can be just as tedious as the battles at times, because it allows you to learn words and themes or whatever, and things just in general from the game by speaking to certain NPCs, and then you present those words to people, and it amounts to basically nothing. All it really amounts to is making the game more tedious by needing to present the correct words to people in order to advance dialogue, instead of just being like any other game and just letting the dialogue advance by having the conversation happen. I was literally just talking about the natural flow of a conversation. Well, this completely disrupts that by forcing you to use these keywords to progress a discussion in the game, instead of just having the character say the thing, or presumably say the thing, especially when it's just in one conversation. There will be times where you'll talk about something and they'll mention a thing, and then you immediately have to say that keyword back to them, and then they'll give you more information, rather than just the game having them mention the thing, and then having the character with in-game dialogue ask about it, and then have the person you're speaking to elaborate. Having to click the word doesn't change anything, it doesn't add anything, it just makes the conversation take longer to get through and make the process mechanically more tedious. Not to mention, if you don't know where to go, it can amount to just walking up to every single NPC in the game, or at least the important ones, presenting them with every single keyword one at a time, just to see which one might trigger progress. And this doesn't make the game more fun. It doesn't make it more interesting. It just makes it more tedious. And the only way in which this pays off at all is there are 1 or 2 secrets hidden behind mentioning very specific keywords to certain characters at certain points in the game. But that's still just more tedious. It doesn't really hide the secrets as much as it incentivizes you to present every keyword to every character in the game at every opportunity, just in the hopes that something might trigger or that you might get some sort of reward or more information. Thankfully, I am using a bug fix patch of this game that, in addition to fixing dozens upon dozens of bugs in this game, it also adds a few small quality of life changes to the game that don't really affect the game in a way that changes how it plays like some quality of life changes might do, but it just makes certain tedious aspects of the game less tedious. One of which is the keyword option will only pop up with important NPCs, characters who will actually have a response to a keyword at some point in the game. They might not have an immediate response, but at some point in the game they will have a response to a keyword, and the keyword option will only pop up with those, as opposed to if you're playing the game in its purest form, it'll pop up with everybody, making the game tedious. Tedious is the best. Tedious and esoteric. Those are the best ways to describe Final Fantasy II. Going back to the battle system, because as I was talking about the keywords, I just remembered that I forgot to mention another thing I really like about this game's battle system, which is items. Normally, I'm not a fan of items in RPGs. I feel like they can be way too overpowered, especially when you can accumulate a massive abundance of them. You can sometimes get to the point in certain games where you can just chug potions to the point where there's no challenge. You can just outlast the enemy and beat them through attrition rather than actual tactics. And items are such a significant contributor to that. Whereas at least with healing spells, you feel more restricted by your magic points, especially if you're wanting to also spend those same magic points on other abilities, aside from just healing. Final Fantasy II mitigates that problem by making it so that you have to equip items. First of all, your inventory is very limited, and items like potions do not stack. In the original NES version, you can only carry a total of 32 items, period. And that even includes key items and equipment that can quickly clutter your inventory, so that you really can't carry around very many restorative items. Not only that, but each character can only take 2 items into battle. And that's up to 2, because you might not even want to be taking any items at all, because you might want to remove or swap out your weapons and shields to either swap weapons or equipment for certain circumstances, taking care of certain weaknesses, or just to cast more powerful spells. So it makes items not be overpowered, but rather be part of your character customization and be something that you have to prepare in advance with strategy and forethought of what you think you might need, rather than just something that you can use to practically cheese yourself out of a bad situation. So I like how items add to the tactical depth and customization in the game, rather than just feeling like an overpowered resource like they do in most RPGs. If I played this game back when it came out, I would probably find that mechanic annoying, especially because a lot of older RPGs in general didn't have excessive inventories, so items were typically more restrictive inherently. But compared to a lot of newer RPGs that just give you way too many items and way too large of inventories, I appreciate Final Fantasy II for restricting that, for inhibiting the item availability in a way that in turn complements tactics and customization. Especially, like I said, with swapping gear, because this game has a magical penalty system, and that is one of the main reasons to look into the game's mechanics and understand how it works online, because unless you're playing the Pixel Remaster version, magic penalty is hidden. It's a hidden mechanic that affects the effectiveness of your spells based on what equipment you're carrying, and it's not always black and white. You might assume that equipping lighter armor and lighter weapons has a lesser magic penalty, and that's the general idea, but that's not even always the case. For example, staves. Staves and rods are typical wizard weapons, so you would think that those are the best weapons in the game to use for a magic user. Not true! The best type of weapon to use for a magic user is daggers. And yes, daggers are also, well, aside from unarmed, which has no magic penalty at all, but I'm talking specifically about weapons. But no, daggers are the best magic user weapon, because they have a consistent low penalty throughout the entire game. You would think staves would have the lowest because they're so conventional for wizard weapons. No, they are not the best. At best, staves match the magic penalty of daggers, whereas some staves have a higher magic penalty. Daggers have a consistent 5% penalty to your magic throughout the entire game. Every dagger has the same penalty. With staves, some of them have 5%, some of them have 20%. How will you know which is which? You won't! You won't unless you look it up online. And spell effectiveness is so erratic and inconsistent. Good luck testing that to figure it out, because odds are you will never be able to do that consistently and reliably. Not only that, you would also think, hey, put a wizard in the back row to protect them, since they could use their magic anyway. Okay, that makes sense. That also makes you think that bows would be good for wizards, because that allows them to fight from the back row. No, bows are the worst weapon in the game for mages, because they have the highest magic penalty of 70%. You do not want a wizard with a bow unless you're keeping item slots open, so that whenever you're casting spells, you can go into the menu, swap your bow off, put it in one of your open item slots, then cast a spell. It's just, and you would think swords would have better magic penalty than axes, because axes are big and heavy, but no, swords and axes are exactly the same. Spears are a little bit lower, which to me makes sense because they're kind of an in-between between swords and staves, but it's barely lower than the swords and axes. And armor can also be extremely misleading. Heavy armor makes sense that the penalty would be high, whereas lightweight armor, it makes sense that the penalty would be low. But then you get armor where it's a glove. The thief's glove, for example. You would think that a thief glove, just a glove, a freaking glove, would have a lower magic penalty than something like a golden gauntlet. But no, I'm pretty sure the thief glove has a higher magic penalty than just about any heavy metal gauntlet in the game. And it's a fucking glove. So the magic penalty system, not only is it completely hidden, I assume it would have been mentioned somewhere in the original instruction manual. I haven't seen the original Famicom instruction manual, and even if I had, I wouldn't be able to read it without Google Translate, which would be questionable at best in regard to its information. But you would, even if you're aware of the magic penalty system, you would hope that it's at least consistent, or you can wager a guess as to what gear would be good for a mage and which you want for your fighters, but you can't because it's unreliable, save for a few things like cuirasses or curious, or I have no idea how that word is spelled. It looks like cuirass, but that just sounds I don't know, that just sounds too stupid. It's almost like I can't accept that that might be how the word is pronounced. But all of those have a really low penalty, so those are really good armors for if you want a front row mage. Their defense isn't as high as other stuff, but whatever. But then you get stuff like the power. It's just called power. And it's like, is that a power glove or a power gauntlet? You won't know. Especially because there's no icon to indicate. There's icons for armor that are misleading as well, because they only have a unique icon for the cuirasses. Those have a light armor icon, and then there's a heavy armor icon for heavy armor. So early on in the game, you think, okay, there's a light armor icon and a heavy armor icon. So that tells you what armor is good for mages and what is good for fighters. No, it doesn't, because the black robe and the white robe, two of the best magic user armors in the game, use the heavy armor icon, not the light armor icon. So even when they have icons to indicate this stuff, it's inconsistent. Not only that, but they only have those icons for body armor. There's no light or heavy icon for helmets or gloves, which there should be to, like, I can understand that there's variances, like certain, like I can accept that maybe bronze armor has a lower penalty than silver armor, while both using the same icon. They're both heavy armor, but they both have slightly different magic penalties for them. I could even accept the cuirasses going up a little bit with higher defense. They don't. I believe all of those only have 1%. But I could understand there being a range based on the type of armor it is, light or heavy. But the icon should be representative of that throughout the entire game. There should be light armor. There should be light armors that show the light armor icon and tells you, like, it should be a range thing. Like, if there's a light armor icon, that tells you, okay, this armor's magic penalty is maybe anywhere from 0% up through maybe 20%, or maybe even just 15%. And then if it has the heavy armor icon, it can be anything above that. You won't know exactly what it is because the stat isn't displayed, but you will know by the icon that it's above this particular range, especially if, or even if you didn't know the exact range. Like, you would probably have to look that up online, but the point is you would look at the icon and know this is light armor or this is heavy armor, and they should have icons indicative of that for the helmets and the gloves as well. The first time I played through the game, there's a helmet you get kind of far into the game, roughly, not quite the halfway point, but maybe about the halfway point. It's hard to say where halfway is, especially because as you get further into the game, the dungeons start getting a lot longer and the battles start taking a lot longer. So while you may be halfway through the game as far as the story goes, you're not even close to halfway as far as the gameplay goes. The point is, there's a point in the game where somebody joins your team and they come with a helmet, at least in the translation I was using, called the gold pin. Now, I saw that and I thought, gold? That's heavy armor. That's probably something I don't want to give to a mage. It's one of the best mage items in the game because it's a gold hairpin. The problem is, I focused more on the gold part than the pin part, which wouldn't have happened if there was a lightweight helmet icon. I wouldn't have known the exact penalty, but I would have seen that icon and been like, okay, this is a magic user armor, I'll give it to a mage. Same with the Thief's Glove I mentioned earlier. I believe the first time I played through the game, I gave the Thief's Glove to my mage, maybe my healer, because I'm like, oh, this is awesome. This armor boasts some amazing defense for this point in the game. It increases my agility, which improves, I think, your evasiveness in Final Fantasy II, and it's lightweight because it's a glove, and a glove would naturally be lightweight, but it's not. So the game tricked me into using a fighter armor on a mage, which it shouldn't be doing, and I shouldn't have to look online to figure this out. So yeah, the game's kind of a mess in that regard. I would love if somebody would make a patch for the NES version that just displays the magic penalty somewhere, because that's the kind of thing that should not be a hidden mechanic. I can understand games having hidden mechanics, but that's the sort of thing where it's like, that's something that should be displayed to the player. I feel like it's hostile to the experience and the player to hide key characteristics and statistics of the characters, especially when it can have such a massive impact on the effectiveness of how you're trying to build and use those characters. It's not such a problem if you're casting Cure or Bolt, spells such as those. It's not really a problem because magic penalty doesn't affect those quite as much. But if you're trying to use status spells or buffs, then they're basically useless unless you have light armor, because they're just going to miss unless you get them to a ridiculously high level. Let me think for a second. And you know what? I'm thinking, I'm looking back at everything that's been discussed, and I think that's about it. I'm pretty sure that was everything that I wanted to discuss, at least to some capacity. I just wanted to give a general talk about the game. The idea was to just explain the mechanics for people who are unfamiliar with it, but I feel like this is one of those games where there's just so much to say about it, especially when it comes to terrible decisions that the game made. But also, in a sense, I feel kind of passionately about those things because this is a game I've always wanted to like. As I said in my countdown video of my favorite Final Fantasy games when I got to Final Fantasy II, I'm pretty sure I mentioned that Final Fantasy II is my favorite game that I don't like. And even though the game is so annoying, so tedious, so boring 90% of the time, it does these little things that brings me back to it every now and then, because it's always a game I've wanted to like more. And as I said earlier in this discussion, I feel like the more you understand the game and its mechanics, the more fun it becomes. But it's still just so tedious and such a slog, and it feels like a chore to get through. Granted, some of that is because of the NES version, but there are certain quality of life changes in later versions of the game that I don't appreciate. I like quality of life changes that make an experience more convenient to the player, especially when it comes to the interface or providing the player with data or information that should have been available to them in the first place, like the aforementioned magic penalty. But what I do not like is quality of life changes that make a game easier. And I feel like that oftentimes becomes a focus of quality of life changes in remakes and remasters. Like with this game, there's the PlayStation version, which would maybe be my favorite, especially because it does make the grinding a little bit less tedious while not completely breaking it. Because in the NES version, like I said earlier, you level up your abilities by using actions. Every time you perform an action, your stats can increase based on the nature of that action. However, you only get the chance to gain that power-up if you performed the action. If you cast a spell, like fire, if you cast your fire spell, you'll gain a little bit more experience to leveling up fire. But only if you actually cast the spell. If you select fire and then the battle ends before you get that spell cast off, you won't gain those fire experience points. The PlayStation version, and I assume other versions as well, changed that. So if you just selected the command, then you'll get the experience points for it, even if the battle ends early. And that can make the grind a little bit less tedious. I can sort of appreciate that just because it reduces the tedium of the game. But then it does things like doubling your inventory space, and I'm less keen on that. Especially when that could contribute to making the game easier because you can now carry more potions, or you can just carry more stuff. You can carry more rewards from the dungeon back to town to then sell, which you can then use to buy stronger gear earlier than you might be able to afford, or start purchasing things like ethers, phoenix downs, and elixirs, while also being able to carry more of those things and being less inhibited by your inventory space. So stuff like that, I'm less appreciative. So we've been going for over an hour at this point, and I think that's going to cut it. As for the future of this series, like I said, this series is going to be me just having very random things to discuss, or maybe doing videos, topics that I don't actually want to make videos out of. Some countdown lists where I would like to discuss the list, but don't want to script it, or don't want to capture the necessary footage. Stuff like that is going to be what this series is going to be, and it's going to take however long it takes, basically. If it ends after just 2 or 3 videos, then it should last longer than that. But if it only lasts a few videos, then that's that. Maybe it'll go on hiatus for 6 months, and then suddenly I'll have a topic that I want to discuss in this format, so I'll do it, and then we'll have the next episode. These are just going to be talking points, or podcast, or vlog-like videos, basically, whenever the mood strikes, or whenever I have an idea, and they're just going to happen to be set to Final Fantasy II footage going on in the background. Either to watch, or just having a little bit of extra noise going on while I'm talking. While also setting sort of a time constraint on this series, because it will likely go until I either just don't keep going because I don't have things to talk about, or until we get through the entire game, which took quite a while. So there's plenty of footage to keep this going for quite some time. With that, if you enjoyed this video, then be sure to do all of the YouTube things, and thanks for watching.